Okay, you are here on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia. This is Hall Monitor, where we discuss local government, city politics, consumer affairs, and much, much more. My name is Larry McGlynn, and I am joined by Denise Clay Murray. Denise, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Denise, you and I before the show were both talking. We both dozed off this afternoon, but we're
Yes.
we're, we're wide awake now,
hmm
and ready to go, and happy to be here with all our listeners and viewers, and our new listeners and viewers who are just finding us now, which is great. Um,
Wow, that's cool.
yeah, so thank you all so much for listening and giving us a chance. We have a big show today. First, we're going to play an interview we did earlier today with Councilmember Jamie Gaudier. And really, this interview kind of focused on one topic, which is affordable housing. And the reason we did that is because there was a hearing yesterday that dealt with affordable housing and some of the things the city could be doing, but more importantly, kind of some of the red flags that are coming up about what's happening with affordable housing in the city. So we wanted to dive a little deeper with Councilmember Gaudier about that, and we're very grateful she was able to meet with us the next day after the hearing to talk about it. And then after that, um, Denise, we're going to talk about an article that you wrote that's in the Philadelphia Sunday Sun. Can you
Mhm.
tell us just a little bit about what we're going to talk about?
Well, this is Black History Month, and we're kind of at a period in American education where you're not necessarily allowed to talk about certain things that happen in terms of Black History Month, and particularly the issue of slavery. Um, a friend of mine who works for National Geographic turned me on to a podcast that Nat Geo was doing called Into the Depths. Into the Depths is this podcast that talks about this group of divers called Diving with a Purpose. They're based out of Washington, D.C., which is apparently the capital for Black scuba divers in the United States. Um, and they go out and they dive looking for the wrecks of slave ships. And if you get and we'll talk a little bit more about it later, but I interviewed Tara Roberts, who was the host of the podcast. And this is a woman who was so dedicated to this particular set of stories that she quit her job, got a got a grant from Nat Geo, and basically followed the divers of Diving with a Purpose around for 2 years, learned how to scuba dive herself so that she could join them in these exhibitions, and has been working with and worked with them to get a whole lot of really interesting stuff out. And we're going to talk a little bit about the podcast itself and where you can find it, and the fact that you should find it because it's really interesting stuff.
And very important,
hmm
especially now. So before we do that, we're going to play our interview with Councilmember Gaudier, and just to sort of set the context a little bit, there's a couple numbers I just want to throw out at our audience just so they understand what's going on. More than half of Philadelphia renters, people who rent their homes here in Philadelphia, spend 30% of their monthly income on rent and utilities,
Oh,
which is more than what is recommended. Philadelphia lacks almost 72,000 affordable apartments for people with very low income households. 72,000. Philadelphia lost nearly 24,000 market rate apartments that had rents that were $750 or less in the past 15 years.
my.
And Philadelphia is at risk of losing 14,000 affordable apartments by 2035. So those are some of the numbers that are kind of the backdrop to this conversation we're going to have. And here's our conversation with Councilmember Jamie Gaudier. Okay, we are here on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia with Councilmember Jamie Gaudier. Councilmember, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Yesterday, you chaired a very important hearing about housing in the city of Philadelphia. And what I'd like to do before we get into the hearing specifically, I'd like to talk a little bit about one of the reasons the hearing was held, the University City Townhomes. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening there.
It's just a heartbreaking situation. The University City Townhomes is what would be considered a low-income housing site at 40th and Market. For 40 years, it's existed as housing in the heart of University City that is affordable to low-income families. So these are mostly 3 and 4 bedroom units, at 40th and Market, near transit, near, healthcare, near jobs, near, schools that people want their children to attend. And several months ago, residents of the townhomes were given notice that the owner was canceling the development's affordability contract with HUD, which is what makes it affordable, and that residents would need to move by July. What's also interesting about the townhomes, among other things, the townhomes is located at a site that was raised for development by the city of Philadelphia in concert with University City institutions. And so at one point, this site and the area surrounding it was home to a very stable working class neighborhood called the Black Bottom. The city eminent domain the lands of the Black Bottom so that University City institutions, including the Science Center, as well as Drexel and Penn, could form and grow. And upwards of 15,000 Black residents were displaced from the Black Bottom. And it is only because former Black Bottom residents and activists fought for affordable housing to be placed on this site that the University City Townhomes even exist in the first place. So after a long fight and a lot of advocacy from former residents, this particular site, as well as a site across the street, was designated to remain affordable housing, and that was a promise to the community. But now, fast forward 40 years later, the land value is a lot different than it was 40 years ago. This is a site that if the owners have the opportunity to level these buildings and sell it for life sciences development, is estimated to be worth between $75 to $100 million. So there's a very strong profit incentive for the owners to move the residents from this site, knock down these buildings and sell it for development. But at the same time, these families have lived there, most of them for over a decade. Some of the families on the site have lived there for over 40 years since the site's inception. And so the prospect of people being asked to pick up their entire lives and move from a place where they feel safe and connected to resources to God knows where is very painful and stressful for residents. And I also think it puts in danger the prospect of having any affordable housing in University City. It's literally one of the last remaining sites. So a tragic situation.
And it's incredibly problematic because when you look at University City, and one of the things that was discussed in the hearing yesterday are the amenities, access to public transportation, jobs, doctor's offices, things like that. Now, if you're asking somebody who's lived there for 40 years to up and move somewhere else, they're losing access to these things. They're probably might have to find new doctors. They might have to do different things. And then there's another unique problem to this. One of the things that came up in the hearing yesterday was the idea of Section 8 vouchers. And so the idea is, okay, if you have to move, we're going to give you a voucher that you can then take to your next residence. But that's not the case usually.
Yeah, so there are a few things at play here. One, I think there's this, thought, in our society that it is okay for people, if they are poor, if they are working class, to just be moved and shuttled all about, right? Doesn't matter if they're moved from neighborhoods where they're stable and where they're connected to a network of resources. If they don't own property, it's fine to just displace people and move them all about the region, right? Whether they feel comfortable and safe with that idea or not. And the other idea is this notion that, oh, it's okay because we're just going to give people housing vouchers and they'll be able to find housing elsewhere. The reality is that it will be incredibly hard for people to find any level of affordability that's close to what they're getting at 40th and Market in an area that is as safe and amenity rich as 40th and Market. Most of the city's affordable housing stock, the affordable housing stock that we have left as a city, are located in neighborhoods that are really struggling with gun violence, with poor housing conditions, with schools that are crumbling, and a host of other issues that residents don't want to contend with. Additionally, as you heard yesterday, nearly half of the people who are given Section 8 housing vouchers are unable to use them because of housing discrimination. So because of their race, because they're elderly, because they have children, or because property owners just don't want to deal with government programs that they see as complicated, many times people are not even able to use those vouchers. So it is very unclear where people are going to go.
And for people who are not able to use the vouchers, they lose over $460 of their monthly income, which is about 41% of their income. That's astounding, astounding. So in your opening remarks yesterday, you mentioned that in order to afford a 2-bedroom unit in Philadelphia, an individual would need to have an annual household income of $50,400 or earn about $24 an hour. At minimum wage, someone would have to work 132 hours per week to be able to afford that. So it's also the compounding of the problem where when you take away somebody's home that they've been in for 40 years and you're taking them out of their neighborhood and you're not giving them the means to find a new place to live that's similar, you're also going to make them work more if they can. You're going to be making them do more things in a different area in order to afford their housing. So when we look at this from things the city can do, and one of the things that came out of the hearing yesterday was that maybe there needs to be more help from the federal government. And I'd like to get to that in a second. But before that, are there any local solutions or things that could help, such as maybe expanding the housing authority? Is there anything like that that can be done that can help mitigate this issue?
I mean, with respect to the townhomes in particular, I introduced legislation last council session that implemented a 12-month demolition ban on the property and also instituted an affordable housing overlay, saying that at least a portion of the site had to be dedicated to affordable housing. That has, the owners don't want that to happen. They do not want that legislation to be permanent. And so it's created a space for negotiation. So we are negotiating, and what we're trying to do is just get the most just outcome possible for the residents and for the future of affordable housing at that site. More broadly, yes, there are things that the city can do, and I think needs to do, because this is a big impending crisis. There are 5,400 of these units that are set to expire over the next 5 years, and a little over 12,000 units that are set to expire across the city in a decade. And that time is going to move quickly. And so the city has to have a plan. And so one of the things that was talked about in yesterday's hearing is this idea of a right of first refusal, where either the city or tenant groups it would be mandated that they have to be approached first with the prospect of buying those properties so that they can remain affordable for residents. I think that's a great idea that we should pursue. Right now, all we have is notice, right? But we need to have a way to like act on that notice. I also think that we need more funding available. If you look at a site like the University City Townhomes, it's incredibly valuable. So for the city to be an active player in a conversation about acquiring that property, we would need to have millions of dollars set aside for this. And I do believe that it's a worthy cause, and we should make more resources available to acquire such properties or to help other organizations acquire such properties. In terms of, PHA and expanding PHA, the Philadelphia Housing Authority is actually governed federally. That's not a city agency. So we would need help from the federal government to really expand the resources of the housing authority. But it is critical that we do so. Right now, the housing authority is working on housing people who signed up for housing 10 years ago. So they do not have the ability to manage the demand for public housing that currently exists in the city without more resources from the federal government. Also, it should be noted that these properties that we're talking about, properties with expiring affordability agreements, these were programs, whether we're talking about low-income housing tax credits or contracts that are supported by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. These were federal programs. So localities work in concert with the federal government to even put these housing developments in place in the first place. So the fact that these developments are expiring and we're now facing this impending crisis should not be something that the city has to face all by itself. We really need the partnership of the federal government and the state government. And it should be noted that we invited HUD. We also invited our state agency, PHFA, to the hearing yesterday, and they declined to participate. And so with such a dire crisis facing us, I would hope that we would see more active partnership from our state and federal agencies on this issue.
And when we talk about the poverty epidemic we're dealing with in the city, housing instability is one of the main drivers of that. So it almost makes too much sense to be having this conversation now and trying to figure out solutions. I'd like to bring in Denise Clay Murray here on WPPM 106.5.
Thanks, Larry. And thank you for joining this, council member. I really appreciate it. You said that over the next 10 years, there's going to be 12,000 units of affordable housing lost due to these covenants coming to an end.
Not all of them, it's not certain that all of them will be lost. What will happen is that the contracts or the subsidies will expire. Some of these are owned by mission-oriented organizations that could choose to renew these contracts. Some of them are owned by private entities like the one at 40th and Market, right? Where they're sitting on land that has become just so much more valuable than when these housing developments were formed. And so the owners, because they're not particularly mission driven, see this as an investment and they see the opportunity to cash out. Moreover, many of these properties need investment so that they're in good working order. So there's the risk that an owner can decide to cash out. There's a risk that an owner doesn't have the resources necessary to keep the properties in good working order. And that puts 12,000 housing units at risk, if that makes sense.
Okay.
And so the city has to identify all these properties, identify when they're going to expire, and come up with a plan so that 12,000 families are not on the street.
Now, since it sounds like we have a little bit of time to work with to put a plan like this together, is that something that's come up in the budget, in the current talks about the current budget, how to at least get started solving this problem?
Yes. I think we're beginning to focus on this issue. I mean, this issue has been around for a long time, and there have been resources from the city to preserve these units, but I would say it's just not enough resources. We have now, with the leadership of Council President Clark, the Neighborhood Preservation Initiative, which will make $400 million available for affordable housing and other efforts over a 4-year period. So some money will come from there, and that will be sort of batted around this budget season. But I also think we drastically need help from our state and federal partners. And with the case of University City Townhomes, I also think it would be good if area institutions also felt an onus to contribute to a just outcome here, since their very existence is the reason why the black bottom was raised in the first place.
Okay, now what is the status of these residents in this townhomes development? Do they still have to be out by July? Are they kind of in limbo? Has an injunction been filed? Where are they now?
Well, many of them are still in the property. I will say that the fact that we instituted a demolition ban on the property, it means that as long as those buildings are standing, they can't evict anyone. So legally, they're not able to evict anyone from the property as long as it stands as a housing development. So I think what we did allowed for more time and space, but what has been stated to the residents by the owner is that there's this July timeline, and that has stressed many people out. And one major reason for that stress is because they don't yet have housing vouchers delivered to them. So it was sort of, when the notice was first given, it was explained to people that they would have a year to find another place to live, right? And they would get housing vouchers and relocation assistance. The housing vouchers have not been delivered by HUD yet. And so people are literally in limbo. They can't actively search for another space until they have, the housing vouchers that would support their ability to move into another housing unit. And so there's a major gap in people really having the ability to look for new housing, but they're still being told by the owner that they need to move by July. So you can imagine how stressful that is for a working person, with kids and many other responsibilities to have to worry about.
Yeah, because no one likes moving. That's just the bottom line. No one likes moving. It's a nasty experience, involves a lot of packing. And when you're trying to do it and you're trying to find affordable housing in a neighborhood that you're used to living in, and I don't think we talk about that much, the fact that you're basically uprooting people from a home that they've known for 40 years.
And, to the places that people are being told about, or it's suggested that they can afford, they do not want to live, they don't want to move there, right? People feel a level of safety at 40th and Market that they do not feel in other areas of West Philly and Southwest Philly, and other areas of Philadelphia. And so that's huge for a family as well. And I just don't think the proper respect has been given to that issue, and to the fact that people deserve to be in a place where they feel safe and connected to amenities and resources.
Now, you had the hearing yesterday, and I'm guessing that that's your response to this issue from a councilmanic perspective. What's next on that, or is there a next step?
Well, we're continuing to negotiate with the owners of the townhomes to try to get a just resolution there. As it relates to the broader issue, we want to convene partners towards some of the solutions discussed yesterday, whether that be implementing a right of refusal policy and coming up with ways to create resident organizations so that residents are able to acquire these properties and have, a say in their own destiny and have ownership in the places where they've been living for so long. Another solution that we want to move on is making sure that we have enough funding to acquire these properties and to invest in these properties. And so there were some really good solutions that came up yesterday that it will take a number of different partners at all levels of government to institute. I also, I'm not sure what kind of infrastructure it will require, but I am also very disturbed by the fact that so few people are able to successfully use Section 8 housing vouchers. And I do think we have to do something about that from a policy and a resident protection perspective. Folks who are using vouchers should not be discriminated against in our housing market. And I think that's something that we'll need to work on as a city as well.
Okay, thanks, Councilwoman. Councilmember, I always get that mixed up. And we'll be. I'll return to Larry McGlynn, my co-host, and Larry, you have another question?
I do, and but just on what you just said, Councilmember, I feel like discrimination is one of the unwritten rules of real estate. Like
unfortunately,
that's just how it's always been in different ways. But at least right now, the problem's identified, and you saw some of the solutions. I was particularly interested in what you just mentioned, that I guess what you would call almost like a co-op model where people could take ownership of the building themselves, and that could be very useful. But do you think, and this is a very tough question to ask because you just had the hearing, but 5 years down the road from now, what are some of the things that have to come together to make that successful resolution? What does that resolution look like? And again, that's a little unfair because you just had the hearing, but I
think the city has to prioritize this issue. I have to be frank in saying that I wish that the response yesterday from the administration about how they're thinking about this issue and acting on this issue was stronger. We have to see this as a crisis, even if we understand that it's not a crisis that we're going to solve all on our own. We have to be willing to rally the troops at other levels of government to help us with this crisis. And we have to understand that people being displaced from their housing is not just a housing issue, that it will put a burden on all kinds of other systems in the city, including the criminal justice system, the healthcare system, the homeless serving system. And so this isn't just about the 12,000 units. It's about what will happen to families and what the full burden will be for the city if we have 12,000 families who lose their housing with no plan and no support from the city of Philadelphia. So I think the first major step that we have to take in really making headway on this issue as a city in the next 5 years is prioritization. The second is advocating to federal partners, state partners, and all of the agencies that will really have to be at the table on this in order for us to come up with a comprehensive solution. But I don't think it's hopeless. I think the runway is long enough. We just have to start now.
Councilmember Jamie Gaudier, thank you so much for being with us.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me and for focusing on this. I really appreciate it.
All right, we would like to thank Councilmember Jamie Gaudier for being with us. And Denise, there's a couple, whenever we talk about issues like this, and really any issue related to poverty, I always feel like there's a couple key things involved here. Number one is racism, just out and out racism. The other thing that I think also ties into racism is a lot of these problems, I feel like maybe they didn't start in the 1980s, but they were exasperated in the 1980s, or the difficulty increased in the 80s because there was this pulling back of funding for cities
Mm-hmm.
in the 80s. And that's why we've talked about this, and we talk about it again in another show, but that's why we have PICA, because the state needed to borrow, or the city needed to borrow money in the late 80s and early 90s. They couldn't do it on their own because their credit rating was so bad that they needed the state to do it.
Right.
And the deal they had to make with the state was, well, if you're going to borrow this money, we want oversight over your budget until the money's paid off, which is actually going to happen in about 2 years. But the point is, you saw a lot of these things that were detrimental to cities, particularly that lack of funding, begin in the 80s. And now, as we sort of move through this, we've always felt those effects, but now you're really seeing where the cracks are and why these things were so bad.
Yeah, because in the 1980s, for those of you who weren't necessarily around during that time, we were being told by our federal government that government is the problem. And because we were being told the government is the problem, government basically decided that they weren't going to take on any or very few of their responsibilities to the American public, particularly the American public that was poor. And by that time, the middle class had all but been obliterated. So we were all just on different levels of poor. And one problem that we have, particularly here in the city, is we can't come to a definition of what affordable housing is. We don't have that. We were not on the same page with it, because you have some people who think that you shouldn't have to pay large chunks of your income for affordable housing. And you also have people who believe that $1,400 a month for a one-bedroom apartment is affordable housing. So, we're still having trouble trying to, make sense of these things. And in the poorest big city in America, which is what Philadelphia is, that's especially traumatizing, because and Councilmember Gaudier was absolutely correct. If all of the people who are currently in affordable housing, or what constitutes affordable housing here in the city, end up losing that housing because everybody sees the gold in them dar hills and decides they want to cash in, it's going to cause a lot of problems all the way around for every other system here in the city. But now would be the best time for council to, at the very least, get started looking at this problem. You have money from the American Rescue Plan that you can use as seed money to get the process started. You don't necessarily have to create new programs with it or anything like that, but you can use it as a starting point to get this problem at least looked at. And if they decide to not use any of that money toward that end, that's really an opportunity lost.
And that's something we've been asking about for well over the last year. What are we planning on doing with this money? And what we've been hearing is, well, we have to fill budget holes.
Right.
And I don't think anybody's satisfied with that answer.
No.
At least not the members of city council whom we speak regularly. You're absolutely right that it's strange to say that the pandemic created an opportunity, but in terms of this financing, it did. And if we 10, 15, 20 years from now, if we're looking back on this and saying we didn't get any return on investment on that money,
right,
that's a big mistake. And that seems to be what we're looking at right now. Now, to be fair, some people will tell you not having those budget holes and not running deficits and being able to maintain our current level of programming and funding of programs, things like that, is a good solution or a good help, because later on, if you're not doing that, you'll have other problems. I can see that, but I also think it's a little short-sighted to look at it that way. But hopefully we're going to see some changes here. And there are a lot of things, when we've talked about this, that when you look at all the vacant properties we have, there are opportunities there. There are opportunities in other ways as well. Even if we're not going to get any more federal or state money. And honestly, I think it's more likely you get federal money than state money at this point. Just the way that the composition of the state legislature makes it a challenge. But this is something we're going to keep an eye on. We think this is really, really important because, we focus a lot on poverty and anti-poverty programs. And one of the most important ways to stop poverty or stem poverty is affordable housing. It needs to be here.
And what I also found interesting is when Councilmember Gaudier said that not everybody was going to let their agreement for affordable housing lapse, and that some people might renew them. I think that as Philadelphia becomes more popular with people in DC and people in New York who are looking for a less expensive place to live that will still allow them to do their jobs in either city, and folks see Philadelphia as that place, I think we're going to have a lot more of these expired agreements than less. Because let's face it, if it's a choice between making a quick $100 million and making sure that people who don't have a lot to work with have what they need, most developers are going to go with door number one. So this is really a problem that the city needs to get a handle on sooner rather than later, especially since there's development going on all the time. And there's development that, was supposed to include affordable housing in it a while ago that hasn't had that affordable housing component. So, they really need to get on this, because as the city becomes more popular with people from New York and Washington as a potential place to land, the more expensive it's going to get for people who already live here that may need to go somewhere else. And I can tell you right now, if you come to Jersey and you buy a house, those taxes are going to kill you. And while Delaware is cheaper in some ways, it's not cheaper in others. So, so pretty soon there's going to be a whole lot of us who are dealing with affordable housing issues that, need to be rectified sooner rather than later.
Right. And when we talk about Philadelphia as that kind of in between New York and Washington, I wonder how much longer that's going to last, because we are seeing property values here in the city go way up in certain parts of the city. So West Philadelphia too. So it stands to reason that 40th and Market is prime real estate, considering.
Oh yeah.
Looking down the road, what could happen.
Yeah, as soon as she said 40th and Market, I said, I know exactly what the problem is.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So like I said, we're going to keep an eye on this. We think it's really, really important. And it affects everybody. This is one of those things where if you live in the Northeast, or you might think, well, I don't have to worry about that. No, you do. Because the more affordable housing we lose creates a big ripple effect across the city in so many different ways. That's going to be really hard to reverse if we let this go on too long. So we're going to keep an eye on it, and we're going to be asking more council people about it. And we're going to see what kind of solutions we get over the next year or two, because that's what's really going to have to happen. So now shifting gears, Denise, I've been waiting for this for a week now. I read the article that you wrote, and I'm really interested in it. So tell us about what's happening and how you did the story, and I want to know everything.
Okay, well, I have a friend that works at National Geographic. Her name is Carla Willis, and she is she's an executive editor for sound projects at National Geographic. So she put something out on Facebook saying that, this this project that was coming up for Black History Month on these divers that were looking for slave ship wreckage was coming up. And I saw it and I was like, oh, I'd like to interview them. That sounds really interesting because, let's face it, Black History Month, there's the same 5 Black history stories that always seem to be in every publication. There's either like somebody who's, taking a group of kids to Africa, which is a decent thing, but you're not getting a lot of that, during the time of COVID, or, something about, someone teaching Black history in some unusual or unique way. And again, that's good, but you're not getting a whole lot of that because right now everybody's afraid. Decided to equate critical race theory, which you have to go to law school to get, and Black history, and those two things are so far apart that it's ridiculous. But it just happens to come up during Black History Month, so people have to talk about it. So when I saw that this was coming up on National Geographic, I thought it was really interesting, and I asked, how would I get in touch with someone to do a story on this? Because A, I'm a podcast town, and B, I like history. My husband Chris has his master's degree in African American studies. So he talks a lot about African American history that you may not have heard about. He's working on a book on boxer Jack Johnson. And we talk about this kind of stuff all the time. And what I found most interesting about this is, one, scuba diving isn't something that you commonly associate with African Americans. You don't really associate water sports with us. It wasn't until the Olympics when you started seeing Simone Manuel and other people who were Black swimmers that you started to associate African Americans and water sports even a little bit. But this group of scuba divers called Diving with a Purpose um, goes out and tries to find wreckage of slave ships. Um, they've found wreckage in places as far away as Costa Rica and Togo and Benin and off the coast of Africa and various places. And what they do is they look for that wreckage to try to tell the story of the ships and the human cargo that they were that they were leaving on various shores. Um, the reason why they ended up being shipwrecks and not just full on ships is because once the European continent and other places started to outlaw slavery, it was illegal to do. And if you were doing it, that's a crime. And, what do criminals do when they're caught, in a vehicle where they are committing a crime? They get rid of that vehicle. And just like someone would do a bank robbery and get rid of the car that they used to do the bank robbery, these slavers would be taking, their human cargo, which was slaves, dropping them off and getting rid of the boat because it was illegal. And they found a lot of these slave ships and and they're not complete wrecks. They're pieces of wrecks because they've been underwater for a couple hundred years, and it was really interesting. I interviewed Tara Roberts, who hosts the podcast Into the Depths. It's a National Geographic podcast, and I strongly suggest that you take a listen to it. It's anywhere you get your podcast, and it drops on Thursdays. In fact, the first 3 episodes are on right now, and you should check them out, where they talk about going into the ocean and diving and seeing these slave ship wrecks and mapping them out, because they have geographers and archaeologists that are doing this too. And it's really interesting stuff. It's become my new favorite listen on Thursdays. And there's also going to be a companion article that's the cover story for March's National Geographic. So you should catch that too. The photography is amazing. I mean, the pictures of these divers going underwater and looking for these shipwrecks is really, really good stuff. And there's also a documentary. If you have Hulu, you can catch it. It's called Clotilda, the Last American Slave Ship. And it's one of the last slave ships that came to America in 1860. Now, 1860, you weren't supposed to be, catching slaves and bringing them to America anymore. But again, this was a criminal activity. So criminals are going to criminal, which meant they were trying to get rid of the boat they used to bring these 144 enslaved Africans that they had brought over from Africa. And they tried to wreck the ship and burn it in Alabama. But unfortunately, because of where they chose to wreck it, it got stuck in the mud. And while the ship sank, it didn't burn. So there's this entire ship that has since been discovered. And if you like, you can catch the documentary about that on Hulu. But if you're really into that kind of thing, if you're a history geek and you're into that kind of thing where you're seeing history that you may not have known about, and you like National Geographic and how they tell stories, this is really going to interest you because it's really interested me.
I was trying to unmute myself. I read the article that you had in the Sun, and there were a couple things in there that really kind of took me back. And the first thing I'd like to ask you about, and she talks about going to Togo and Benin, and that's where her ancestors were from.
Well, here's the thing. If you're looking for your ancestry, if you're African American and you're looking for your ancestry and you want to go back any further than 1870, you're not going to be able to. And the reason why you're not going to be able to is because they didn't actually start counting Black people as people for the purpose of the census until 1870. Before that, we were considered 3/5 of a person because we were property. But in 1870 is when they started counting us as human beings. They call it the wall. They call it the ancestral wall when you're trying to do that research. Because originally she was trying to find out whether or not, Tara Roberts was trying to find out whether or not there was a particular ship that her family could connect to. But because of this 1870 wall, she couldn't find one. Now, if you were looking in a place like Togo or Benin or somewhere or even Costa Rica, they didn't have those restrictions. And you have people that can directly connect their ancestry to a ship where people were taken and people were shipped away. Like as part of the series, in fact, it was the most recent podcast, episode 3 that I was listening to last week. You had a group of young divers from Costa Rica that could directly connect themselves to the Africans that were dropped off there. There was a storm and it was a shipwreck, and the Africans were taken off of the ship so the ship could be repaired. And while hundreds of them were recaptured and taken other places, you had Africans that managed to escape into the forest and not be found, and they were able to start families and live lives without being considered slaves. And you had people who were able to trace their lineage back to those people. Now, if you do something like ancestry.com or one of the DNA things that you can get, you can find out exactly what tribe your family may have come from. You can find out what section of Africa you may have come from your DNA, but you can't connect it to a specific slave ship or family line necessarily because of when they started counting us as human beings in this country.
And that's one of the things that I've been able to do. A relative of mine did a very detailed family history, and I know who my great grandfather was. I know his name, James McGlynn from Hazleton, Pennsylvania. And he worked in coal mines. That's another thing that was taken from African American people, to know who your ancestors were, and it's again one of those reprehensible things. But this is that kind of attempt to connect a little bit, and sort of fill in some of those gaps a little bit. So can you tell us a little bit more about her motivation to do?
Well, she discovered the whole diving with a purpose thing through going to the National Museum of African American History and Culture in DC. And if you have not gone there yet, you really need to go, because it's an awesome museum. Now, there are parts of it that are hard to get through. The whole bottom half of the museum talks about the Middle Passage, the transatlantic slave trade, and who engaged in it, and those kinds of things. So that's not for the faint of heart. But what it does is it takes African American history, it takes the history of African Americans from when we came here to where we are now. And she discovered, as part of going to the museum, this picture that was of these Black scuba divers. And that was where she discovered diving with a purpose. And at the time, because this woman quit her job, she was working for a nonprofit, and she quit her job because the job that she was working at was talking more about women's empowerment issues. And that's important. But it was during the time of the George Floyd uprisings, and we were having this discussion on, race and racial fairness and different things. And she felt that she needed to engage more in that conversation. And she decided to do that through getting training to be a scuba diver and going out with these divers and looking for these wrecks. And through that process, she even decided to learn a little bit more about her own family, because a lot of times, and this is something that comes up when we talk about movies, you had a lot of people who didn't want to go see movies like 12 Years a Slave. Like, I've only seen it once. Once is all I can get through it. And part of the reason for that is, when you are the descendant of a people that was owned by somebody else, you don't necessarily want to have to relive that experience in any kind of way. And Tara Roberts talks about how there was this picture of her great grandfather Jack that she didn't really try. I mean, her mom was, doing all sorts of research on the family and stuff, but she didn't really want to engage, because she didn't want to think about the fact that basically her family was owned by somebody else at one time. And once she started doing these dives and seeing this wreckage, she decided to look into her own family, and she learned more about her great grandfather, who had fought with the United States colored troops during the Civil War and owned land in North Carolina, and had done all of these different things. But when I talked to her, you could just feel how energized she was by going out and doing this project, and doing all this learning about these slave ships and how we got here and what happened and the process and all of those different things. You could tell how energetic she was about this. It was infectious. And it's the kind of thing that made me say, okay, I have to check this out, because this person is so excited about this project. And I asked her, you're done with this now. You're a National Geographic storyteller. Is this the end for you? And she said that it's not. There are more stories that need to be told, about these particular things, about these ships and different things. And she wants to go out and tell these stories. And I hope she gets to do so, because so far, what I've seen and read have been, heard and read has been really interesting. And those are the kinds of stories that we need to know in this country to make sure that our history is as complete as possible. And the thing is, it's not about making other people feel bad. It's about making sure the record is straight. Um, I don't, I mean, look at you and I. I do not blame you at all in terms of how my family ended up here. That's not the problem. But the thing is, you can't keep something like this from happening again unless you understand how it happened in the first place. If you don't know the past, you are doomed to repeat it. And that's why it's kind of disappointing now that we're having a full on discussion on certain things like the Civil War and other things where we're trying to revise something instead of telling the truth about it. No matter what anybody tells you, the reason why the Civil War happened was because the South wanted to continue to enslave people. The North didn't want to do that. And the South felt so strongly about it, it seceded from the rest of the country. And that was what that war was about. Now, when you talk about the fact that, Abraham Lincoln, despite the reputation of being the great emancipator, was trying to emancipate people to possibly send them back to Africa and have America be a completely white country again, when that's the part that people get mad when you talk about. But it's an important part because you have to know all of it. And that is what's so interesting about diving with a purpose and into the depths and everything about this story. What was so interesting about it was it's history you can't get away from, but it's told in such a way that you get the knowledge without necessarily feeling like, people are going to be, you know, what it's getting the knowledge and understanding it without it feeling politicized.
You mentioned that people are kind of running from this history now, trying to omit it, trying to revise it, and that's one of the scariest things that's happening right now.
Mm-hmm.
And you said it quite eloquently. When you do things like that, you're giving license for it to happen again.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're not teaching people that we've already tried this and it was horrible, and we stopped it. People need those examples because it just keeps happening, and you can't tell me it doesn't, because if you look in other parts of the world, these things still happen.
Mm-hmm.
And we're seeing potentially history repeat itself in Russia and other places across the world in different ways. But it's definitely disconcerting. Some of the action school boards are taking in certain states, certain municipalities, and it makes you wonder the disparity that's going to occur in our education system between the states that are holding things back and changing things and the states that are telling their kids the truth.
And it's going to be a big disparity. And the thing is, let's just be honest here. Eventually, the kids that you're trying to keep from discovering this history are going to go to college. And they're going to go to a place like a Temple University where you have to take at least one African American studies course in addition to intellectual heritage in order to graduate from college. And I remember when I was taking African American studies from the 1800s to the present at Temple University, you had all of these white kids who had never heard any of the stuff that the professor was teaching them. And many of them dropped the class because they couldn't handle it.
Yeah.
And the thing is, history isn't something you handle. It just is. And we have to treat it that way.
That's right. Well, Denise, thank you so much for telling us about that. And thank you to Councilmember Jamie Gaudier for being with us tonight. We'll be back next week. And until then, have a good week.